Hello, world. Welcome to the Speed Strength Show. I'm Tommy.
I'm Braden. And what is your favorite office moment or cold open?
Oh, man.
If you have to
That's
pick
not a
a,
fair question.
if you have
You
to pick a
can't ask
few,
somebody that.
if you have to pick a few,
There's too many.
if you have to pick a few, that's fine. Or a
Oh,
couple. There's two. Or let's keep it to cold opens then. Because moment is way too broad potentially.
I mean, and initially I have one for each of them.
Okay, well, let's share that then.
I think like the safety day cold open is
Ooh, I don't even know
like
if I remember.
amazing. The fake fire drill
Oh, where
when
Dwight
when
sets a fire, a garbage can on
yeah,
fire. Yeah.
yeah, and then just the cat like there's so many little things that go on, like whether it's Angela tossing the cats up in the rafters to Oscar as he climbs up into the ceiling to try to go get help.
Yeah. And then the
Um,
cat comes back down
and
later.
the cat comes back down like four tiles over.
Yeah.
Um, and then, everybody just like panicking. And I forget who it is. I think, is it Michael and I think Michael and Nardog who used the photocopiers like a battering ram on the door and
Yeah.
they're trying to slam it. And there's Kevin in the emergency throwing the chair to break the glass on the vending machine to steal all the
Yeah.
snacks and the candy. Like there's just so many wild things that happen
Yeah.
in that opening scene
Yeah.
that are just like incredible,
Yeah.
incredible. And I love that cold open.
I think somebody tries to take the fire extinguisher and throw it like through the window or something like that too.
Oh,
Somebody
is
tries to throw something through the window.
yeah, that's Michael. And
Okay.
then he's calling for help. He
Yeah.
throws the fire extinguisher or the chair or something through the window
Oh
to
man. Yeah.
break the window so then he can yell out for help.
I
Like
feel
just the worst fire safety protocols you can think of.
yeah. I feel like I'm not sure, but I feel like I do remember it being the fire extinguisher. And if it is, I feel like I'm just noticing it now. That's so like clever to make it that, because
There's
that's the
so many
one thing
clever.
that's useful.
I think if I recall correctly, he throws the chair and it doesn't break the window, and then he
Mm,
throws the fire extinguisher. I think that might be it. It's been a while
yeah.
since I've
Yeah.
seen it, but yeah, there's just so many little things going on, and it's 2.5 minutes of like just nonsense,
Yeah.
nonsense.
That is a good one. That is a good one for sure. Um, I think for me, I have two, and they're both openers. Which I couldn't remember that one, so that's great to think about. Um, the one is where where Dwight impersonates Jim, because Jim impersonated Dwight first. That's why it
Yeah,
happened. And just that line, like, which bear is best? False. Black bear. Yeah. Bears eat beets. Like all those lines are just so like funny to me. They just stick in my head. Um, and then the other one is Asian Jim for
that
sure.
one's classic.
Yeah.
That's so good.
Yeah. I love that one. Just the planning for that one, getting like the picture and everything is beautiful.
Yeah, it's his level of like attention to detail on any prank he pulls
Hmm.
is second to none.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
no stone is unturned.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, one more, I guess, that comes to mind. I can't remember if this was like Jim just moved Dwight's desk into the restroom, or if he wrapped boxes shaped like a desk and then moved the actual desk into the restroom. I can't remember if there's the same one or not.
Oh, that's a good question.
But when Dwight realizes that his desk isn't where it is, I think Jim's like, "Oh, that's weird." Um, and then goes to the washroom, and then Jim just calls him on the like his phone, like, what's the printer code? Just like, oh, come on, Jim, you got to know this stuff. Oh man, just like it's just the most mundane thing after the prank is complete, you know.
The other one I was debating on, I can't remember if it's a cold open or not, is the one where Stanley and Dwight basically dupe Jim into filling Dwight's desk with a bunch of meatballs or
Mm.
doing to all his office stuff with the jello that he did in the previous one, but with meatball instead.
Yeah,
And then at the end of the cold open, Dwight Dwight and Stanley are sitting there like, oh, we got enough meatballs now for the next like 8 weeks and we don't have to do any cooking.
Yeah.
And so you realize that they've like basically taken advantage of Jim's
Yeah.
ability to prank. Where he's like, oh no, you meatballed me again. Are you kidding me? Like, not
Yeah.
again.
And then Stanley's just cracking up.
Yeah, and Stanley's just dying. And then Jim's like, yeah, this is a good prank. Stanley loves it.
Oh, yeah.
Meanwhile, he just loves it because then he takes home all the meatballs at the end of the day and puts them
Yeah.
in the freezer.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that was a cold open. I can't remember though.
I think so. I think so. Yeah.
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 There's quite a few of them though, but those are the two that
Yeah. Okay.
stick out to
So
me.
that was your moment.
Well, no, the moment is I probably quote Kevin more than any other character in The Office.
Yeah, for
Like
sure.
you have to quote Kevin, and I'm debating between the two most common things that I frequently reference him for.
I feel like
I
I know
do-
one of them.
Sorry,
I feel like I know one of them.
which one?
The what's the line exactly? Why use lot word when few word do trick?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
many little time make big time.
Yeah.
And I just like, yeah. So whichever one that also, no, that wasn't a cold open, was it?
I don't think so.
No,
don't
because
think
he has
so.
like the meeting with Andy about it being like the dress code equivalent of wearing underwear by not using enough words when you talk. But I love all the lines when he's just sitting there and like, and he's telling, I think he's telling the camera at that point. He's like, many little time make big time.
Yeah.
When Kevin president, they see. And I'm
Yeah.
just like, oh, the line of many little time make big time, or many small time make big time. I love using that quote.
Yeah.
And I also like the one, I think it's from season 2 or 3, where he's doing the practicing act, like the Australian accent with Kelly.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And then she's like, how about Australian? He's like, oh, I like ice cream too, mate. Alligators, dingo babies.
Yeah.
And I love using the line dingo babies
Yeah.
with that like horrible Kevin Australian accent. So those are probably my two most quoted things from The Office, like on a daily basis
Yeah.
that I use, which would lead me to say those are probably two of my like favorite moments. I could watch that Australian accent interaction, like that 10-second thing over and over and over again. It's hilarious.
Yeah, that's good. I feel like if we were to poll like 1,000 Office fans, I mean, maybe it's not true, but I feel like the one that I see the most is the chili. Kevin dropping the chili.
Oh, it's kind of depressing though.
It is.
It's like
It
such
is.
a sad moment.
Yeah.
He's
So-
using the like the note ring of paper
Yeah.
to try to like scoop the chili just helplessly back into the big pot.
Yeah.
I feel terrible for him.
Yeah, that's true. It's like the one thing he's good at, apparently. It fails. Oh. Oh man. I always wonder how he got hired. Like they did talk about he applied for a job in the warehouse and then Michael thought he would be good in accounting for whatever reason.
And that's how he ended up in accounting. Like that's how accountants work, right?
Yeah. Man. Yeah. Great show. Great
There-
show.
you could do endless episodes on all the hilarious moments.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like we didn't even touch on Michael. We didn't even touch on like any of the moments like Oscar is brutally savage in some cases with just his quiet one-liners that he drops and you're like, oh wow, that was hilarious.
Yeah.
Creed coming out of nowhere with like the most random lines.
Yeah.
Like we're missing there's so many elements that we're missing, but it's too much to cover in like one intro.
Yeah, for sure.
But those would be my highlights, I think.
Yeah, maybe a similar intro question will make an appearance later. But yeah, I thought we'd have fun with that one.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. I like that one.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's been a little while since we recorded again. I kind of forget how to do a transition.
That's all right.
I guess. Well, here's a good one.
By stating you forgot to do or forget how to do a transition, you basically transition.
I guess that's the most
people know
common.
the change is coming.
Yeah, that's the most common way to do it. But if we were to go through all of the Office moments that we think are funny, or every episode, or all the cold opens or whatever. It would take some endurance to accomplish that task, I would say.
Take time.
Yeah.
It would take time.
Big time. It would take big time.
It would take big time. Yeah, not little time.
No. Well, it would be done in many small time.
Uh, that's fair. That's a good point.
So yeah, we are not talking about The Office any more than we already have, probably. We'll see. We're talking about energy systems, aerobic
are.
training, aerobic adaptations, etc.
Yeah, it's a big topic. That the et cetera is appropriate because there's a lot of places you could go with this.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
It's a big system.
it's a big system. Yeah, so we ended off last episode talking about just different things that are capable of adapting and have an influence on your energy production, for lack of a better term, in the various systems. I think probably the most important one, well, the two most important ones I would say are muscle and heart. I think are probably the two most important ones, in my opinion. Anyway,
Like you mean like where the adaptations take place and things like that.
yeah, like it just has like those are the things you want to consider the most, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, which I mean kind of lines up. There was a paper I read from a Polish researcher who does a lot of sprint stuff. But there was a paper he did on adaptation to aerobic training with soccer players. And in some of the intro part of the paper where they were talking about other studies and what things have found is that, aerobic performance is really dependent on the ability to uptake oxygen, where your anaerobic threshold sits at, and then the economy of the movement that you're performing, right? Which if you want to have oxygen uptake and the aerobic threshold in the right spot, you certainly need to have adaptation at the level of the heart and the muscles to make that work. I would argue the economy is a little bit more of it's not a true aerobic thing. That's probably more of a neuromuscular, coordinative adaptation that you make in terms of better timing, force and muscle activation and, things like that. But the idea behind oxygen uptake and anaerobic threshold having a big influence on someone's aerobic performance definitely means we need to create adaptation at the level of the heart and at the level of the muscle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exercise economy is an interesting one because it just like the more you improve that, the less metabolically active you need to be to hit the same task. And also there was one thing I saw that like potentially the like less muscle activation necessary to do the same task means less compression, means less like pressure on the blood vessels in the area, which potentially means like higher clearance of metabolites and things like that, which I thought was an interesting thing, but we'll probably come back to that stuff.
Yeah, to me that the economy piece is a little bit more maybe like part 3 in this, where we're talking about like what to actually do in training and some ideas and things like that, because at the end of the day, the modality you pick doesn't really matter.
Well, it's got to be specific to what you want to be doing.
Yes, but in terms of creating adaptation at the level of the muscle and the heart, particularly the heart.
Yeah.
Whether you hop on a rower, whether you hop on a bike, whether you go running, whether you whatever, the heart in particular will adapt, and the vessels and things like that. So I think the idea behind movement economy is a little bit more geared towards like specific performance.
Yeah.
In that regard, is where if you're just looking for a general aerobic adaptation, you have a lot more to pick from in that sense.
Yeah, 100%. But yeah, that's a good way to describe it, like oxygen uptake and anaerobic threshold for sure. Or anaerobic threshold being essentially the level at which you can like clear metabolites at the same rate that you're producing them. So we talked about last time how like the aerobic system is great at producing a lot of energy, but it's very slow. So if you need energy at a faster rate, then you're using other means, and the other means create more metabolites essentially.
Yeah. Well, and you might be at a point where you're creating, I'm just going to make up random numbers here, creating 100 metabolites a second, but
Yeah.
your body can only clear 50. So
And
every
then,
second that you do something, you're going to have this buildup of what's it called? Of metabolites.
yeah.
And that obviously leads to fatigue and pH changes and all that type of stuff.
Mhm.
So, like you said, if you can find that aerobic threshold where is I'm creating 50 metabolites, but clearing 50 metabolites, that's as fast as you can move or do something without inducing like a tremendous amount of fatigue.
Yeah.
Which,
You
if
can
we're talking about,
sustain that.
and talking about endurance sport and being able to sustain something over and over and over for a long time, that's a really important thing to have.
Yeah. Essentially, what you're looking at is raising that threshold either through, well, so um, you can raise it by being able to clear metabolites faster or producing them slower, essentially. And the producing them slower part is going to be dependent on the oxygen uptake big time. Um, there was a few papers that were talking about like novice athletes, or sort of like novices, not athletes, are limited typically by oxygen delivery. So we're looking at adaptations in the heart, and then experts or athletes or well-trained people are limited more by uptake and like metabolic power and things like that. So we're looking at then adaptations in the muscle and to the mitochondria and things of that nature, because the heart, it turns out, is very trainable, and can be quickly trainable actually. When I was talking with my cardiac phys guy or cardiorespiratory phys guy, like you can have adaptations to like plasma volume. Increased plasma volume can be within like days or weeks. So that's increasing your stroke volume. It's like semi-artificially, but you do get increased, like there is oxygen that's transported in the plasma. So you are getting more oxygen delivery, and I mean more red blood cells as well with increased plasma, um, or increased stroke volume. Sorry, so more oxygen delivery initially, and then there's obviously bigger adaptations, um, like the hypertrophy, left ventricle hypertrophy, which take more like a year, was one number that I found. And then one thing that I found really interesting after the fascia series we did was the pericardium, the um, pliability, or like how tense it is, essentially, how restrictive it is. Um, that has a huge impact on like how much the left ventricle is allowed to fill, because that's like the main thing. So there was a study on like they used pigs, and some of them they removed the pericardium completely, and instantly stroke volume was like so much bigger. So over time, that like connective tissue around the heart is becoming more pliable,
Yeah,
allowing
so
you
it
to
can
move
stretch
more.
and fill, right?
Yeah.
And then if it stretches more, then there's more pressure. So when it
Mhm.
goes to eject, it sort of like it's a positive cycle.
Yeah, so that you're able to stretch faster, contract faster, um,
Eject blood
and
faster
yeah, and then also
and more
within,
blood.
yeah, and like you're doing all these things in the same amount of time. Like the heart rate doesn't change, but you're able to, yeah, stretch faster and contract faster and fill faster, because um the pressure, or sorry, filling the volume at zero filling pressure is higher in trained athletes. So when you get to like you're fully contracted, then you have more negative pressure. So you're like sucking blood in faster. So you do all the things at the same rate as a non-athlete. It's just so much more blood, essentially.
Yeah, it's better bang for buck.
Yeah.
You get more in the same, like you said, you get more in the same period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of blood and oxygen and delivering those things to the body, yeah, more in the same amount of time is going to be better.
Yeah, absolutely. And for that, I mean, it seems like the training you do doesn't really matter. Like it's
Well, at the level of the heart, it doesn't.
no, it's like it's a muscle. So we did the hypertrophy series too, which we found the training you do doesn't really matter. Hypertrophy happens always. There's some things that are maybe more of a potent stimulus. But if you do a lot of work at a light intensity and not very much work at a heavy intensity, it's all hypertrophy, you know, and there is a balance that can be struck where it's the same level of hypertrophy regardless of what you're doing. And that's what the cardiac guy was saying too. Like HIIT training is very good for this. Steady state is very good for this. If you balance the time multiplied by intensity, however you figure that out, and that's equal, then adaptations should be the same. And that's what the research shows, is that adaptations are the same if time intensity is the same. But HIIT is nice because you can do more intensity for more total time in less like world time.
Yeah, you can. I get what you're saying. The output in 20 minutes of HIIT might be the same as 60 minutes of steady state.
Because you were just talking about how like the lactate or the anaerobic threshold exists. So there is a finite level that you can maintain for an amount of time. So that's the maximum intensity you can do for an extended period of cardio versus like with HIIT, you can do like 30-second bouts of 130% of VO2 max
And still come back.
Yeah. And then you can do more of them, versus like you could do maybe 45 minutes at like 80% VO2 max if you're well trained.
Yeah. Which, like you said, it at the level of the heart, it doesn't really matter because you're going to get the adaptations you're looking for. And again, some of the stuff we haven't talked about yet in terms of like your heart rate will drop, but your stroke volume goes up. And so it effectively makes your heart more efficient because it can eject and move more blood by contracting and being active less. Which if you're thinking about, just the efficiency on your heart, it doesn't have to work as hard all the time. So if you can, and that's why, again, you see a lot of these like very well-trained endurance athletes have a very low heart rate because that's the adaptation that's aerobic training is pushing towards, is making the heart more efficient and making it capable of doing greater outputs with less input.
Which it's kind of an interesting, like, of course it makes sense. Like if you're able to, if you need X amount of blood and you're able to do that with one contraction versus two contractions, then of course you're only going to do one. So your heart rate is halved essentially. But it's interesting to think about, like it's so intuitive, but it's interesting to think about that being an adaptation because an in like highly trained endurance athlete then has like an extra 30 beats per minute that they can add from their resting heart rate compared to like an untrained person. Like if a normal is like 70 and then a highly trained endurance athlete is 40, then they can increase their like heart rate up to your resting rate and be doing like reasonably intense exercise.
Exactly. And be substantially, like have substantially greater outputs than you. So it gives them more range. It's almost, it's like a car having 5 gears versus 6 gears.
Yeah.
And both cars get to 5th gear and then one car is nowhere to go. And the endurance trained athlete goes, well, see ya, because I have another gear that I can tap into because I wasn't like on the front end or the starting end. It gives you a wider range of heart rate to work with effectively.
Yeah.
Because most people aren't even capable of getting their heart rate down to 40 or 50. So, and these people are starting there. So like you said, and that's an important adaptation as well. again, also just because if that's the strategy that, and it's not really a strategy that you're intentionally choosing, but if that's, we look at the best in the world at certain things and figure out how are they getting this done. And if that's an adaptation and that's something that the body is doing and allowing elite endurance athletes to perform in that way, then if we want to improve somebody's aerobic endurance or their aerobic capacity or performance capabilities, whatever it is, then we should probably be trying to look for some of those same adaptations. Mm-hmm. In the sense that, like you said, the hypertrophy of the heart, the increased stroke volume, the decreased heart rate, the increase as a result of all of that being greater amounts of cardiac output or more blood and more oxygen being delivered, then those are all positive adaptations. And it's going to help us in terms of the overarching theme of oxygen uptake, because that's the mechanism that delivers oxygen to where it needs to go.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it makes sense that endurance athletes are limited by the uptake and the metabolic output, because they've addressed the part, like, you get the oxygen there, you have enough oxygen there. Now it's how well can you use it? Versus, novices or untrained people are just like, I can't get enough oxygen to where it needs to be, and that's the end of the story at that point.
And ventilation isn't the limiting factor either.
No, there's no
like your ability to breathe and take in oxygen via like the outside air and put it in your lungs is not the limiting factor either.
No, because that doesn't change. Like, it changes with exercise, but you don't become better at breathing through cardio training.
Well, no, and if you reach, I forget if it's KIN 105 or 205, where you modify how you do those maximal VO2 tests, and it's never your ventilation rate or your breathing rate of bringing in oxygen that taps out when you're doing those tests.
No.
So your ability to take in oxygen via breathing is far superior to your ability to move oxygen via the heart and the vessels or take in oxygen at the level of the muscle. Mm-hmm. So again, you're going to get some changes in terms of breathing rate in the lungs and things like that. But like you said, it's not a limiting factor. So like, I don't even know if I would focus on that. Well, or even worry about that. Like, whatever adaptations happen as a result of your training, great. But we know it's not necessarily like the limiting factor for somebody. So if it's not the limiting factor, then it's probably not the most important thing.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about it. Like, from the reading I've done, like the conversations I've had, like, breathing rate like increases with exercise, but like highly trained endurance athletes don't breathe faster at like their maximal. They don't take in more air, they don't have better oxygen exchange or gas exchange in the lungs. It's all the same.
Yeah, it's the ability to use what they're taking in.
Yeah, you would have issues with someone that has like a missing lung or some sort of like cancer or whatever that's limiting the effectivity of a certain, like, a part of their lungs, then you can have less than normal, but normal is normal.
Like, this is going to sound dumb. I don't know the exact cause behind like asthma, right? But then if you can't breathe enough, then obviously you can't get oxygen in. But I get what you're saying. But yeah, unless there's like a medical case of some kind.
Yeah, it's just
breathing's not really.
Yeah, it's not really a trainable area. But yeah, the heart super is, and the muscles super are.
Well, the muscles, the other half that we haven't really talked about.
Yeah. So, well, and then within the muscles, you've got like fiber type, which, like, generally speaking, it's pretty much just a classification for the other things that we're going to talk about, which would be like mitochondrial density, mitochondrial volume, capillary density.
Yeah, those are the big ones, I think.
And then I guess, well, also like mouse and heavy chain isoforms and things like that. But that would be, I guess, when you're shifting fiber types, it would be the expression of the mouse and heavy chains is the main thing that indicates that, because you can like have more or less mitochondria, more or less capillary density in any muscle. So,
well, and that's one of the things that changes as you do like aerobic work is you end up with greater densities
Mhm.
of capillaries in and around the level of the muscle, and you end up with increased numbers of mitochondria within the muscle cell,
Mm.
which the mitochondria, is important for metabolizing oxygen and carbohydrates and things like that within aerobic activity.
Mhm.
So if you have greater capillary density around the muscles, you can deliver more oxygen and more like fuel supply
Mhm.
to those muscles. And then the mitochondria within the level of the muscle is actually what's using that oxygen and, harnessing the energy that then can fuel the muscle. So
Mhm.
if you have more of those things, it's going to improve, like you said, the ability for the muscle at that level to use the fuel and the supply that's coming in.
Mhm. Um, I read a couple of papers that I was kind of surprised by, that there isn't like, so super elite, like been training for multiple years consistently for multiple years to increase endurance performance. You see an increase in cristae density or cristae surface area, which is like the folds within the mitochondria.
Mhm.
Um, so then you have just more surface area for like the electron transport train. I don't really understand mitochondria dynamics that well, but that's my interpretation is like you have more surface area within the mitochondria to produce ATP.
Which the surface area directly, from what I understand, directly influences that. So more surface area in this case is good.
Yeah. So they end up with like the same mitochondrial volume and potentially the same amount of mitochondria, but each mitochondria is more efficient, essentially.
Better at what it does. Does
Yeah.
that differ on the level of the muscle? Like
Um,
depending on the type,
yeah, type 1 fibers are better. Like if you like the more
they have more mitochondria.
they have more mitochondria and like relative to the amount of mitochondria, they also are more capable of becoming more like dense in terms of the cristae, I
Yeah.
believe. Um, and then type 2 is not as much. Um, so that was something that was quite interesting to read. And then like before, like that's going to be gradual, so it is continuously happening after, I imagine if you've been training consistently for a few months that those adaptations are starting to happen, but it becomes meaningful, I guess, after a year or two.
Mhm.
um but before that time, like mitochondria is upregulated with exercise. So like it's not like they're just there all the time. Like you make more of them when you need them, and then they get broken down when you don't need them.
Like
Um,
any adaptation, right? Like
well,
you
but I
can,
mean, like it's so instantaneous is what is what I mean. Like it's like you start exercising. Okay, we need more energy. Let's make more mitochondria, and then when you're done exercising, like
oh,
eventually
this
you
isn't like
just
a
get rid of
training
them.
adaptation, training, like detraining effect.
No, it's very transient. Is what I was reading anyway.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And like I imagine you would get better at that so you can produce them faster and produce more of them. Um,
Mm.
I would imagine that's something like an adaptation that can happen. I can send you the papers if you want. Maybe I misinterpreted something, but like that's how I interpreted it anyway. Um,
That's interesting though, because I
yeah,
would have thought of it as a longer term adaptation and detraining effect, as
yeah,
opposed to, like you said, more transient.
and like I had heard of that, so I was really surprised when I came across these papers, um, to see that this is what that they found. But yeah, and then there is also like the mitochondria can like come together, like fuse and split and move around the muscle to areas of like higher or lower concentrations of oxygen. So if you're delivering oxygen to a muscle and you have a bunch of mitochondria in one area, all the oxygen gets used in that area, then they move to the other areas where there's more oxygen so that they can continue to do their job essentially. Um,
So
which I
they're
thought
not
was interesting as well.
stationary,
No.
which I mean would make sense, right? Because we like when you see a diagram, for example, of a cell, and then you see like the mitochondria in its spot. and you just think, yeah, that's where it lives. That's where it hangs out. But it does make sense that it could move around in theory because it's a contained entity structure and it's within a fluid and a plasma.
Yeah, and I mean the muscle's contracting anyway, so it's going to get jostled.
That's what I mean. So it makes sense that because yeah, this is the problem with, and it kind of goes back to the fascia thing where we talked about what you see in a textbook or in a still shot diagram is not at all the way it actually functions in real life. Because again, when you look at the image of a mitochondria within the muscle cell, it looks like it has its little home and it lives there. But I've never really thought about it until you said it, where I'm like, yeah, it actually is. It's enclosed thing. And it's within a very dynamic and like a literal fluid environment. So it's like a floaty in the pool doesn't just stay in one spot.
Yeah.
It can go anywhere within the pool.
And then it makes sense too. Like I read it and I accepted it. I didn't really think that much about it, but now like it makes sense because if you I don't know if you took any, well, high school bio would have covered this, like prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells.
Oh, it's been so long.
I don't remember which ones. I
know those words. I don't know what they mean.
Yeah, I think prokaryotic is the one where they have organelles.
Okay.
And the mitochondria, like the theory anyway, is that initially the mitochondria was a eukaryotic cell that got eaten by another eukaryotic cell and just continued to live inside of it, but did the energy production thing. So it was like way back when everything was one cell. It was its own thing and it was moving around and it was finding oxygen and it was producing its own energy,
which again would make sense based on this. Again, it's weird because you first see it in a still shot in a diagram or in a like a physical model that doesn't move and everything has its place. So you think of it as this very static thing. But now that we're actually, it makes a lot of sense that it could move around.
And like we know, like,
and it should.
Protein transporters, like transporter proteins that move things around the cells anyway. And like a lot of things move around the cells,
Yeah, it's way more fluid than the textbook picture can ever show.
So it makes sense. But anyway, yes, that's what I read. I found it very, cool. Very interesting.
The transient thing though is very, very interesting because then this is probably more of a part 3. And if you send me the paper, then I'll read it and whatever. But like, it can potentially change the way you think about aerobic training, where if the changes in terms of like the number of mitochondria active in a cell is like it's there and then it's not there, then is aerobic training as hampering to the speed power stuff as maybe we think? Because if there's not a permanent change that's potentially detrimental, then again, it's a very interesting point. A very interesting point.
Yeah. I mean, so for me anyway, like the other adaptations that I'm thinking about in the muscle, like it's not the mitochondria thing that's potentially hampering. I think about the potential fiber type shift where you're changing like a type 2 into a type 1. So you're like the myosin heavy chain isoform is
starts
changing.
To change. Yes. And that expresses the way the muscle is going to produce force differently.
Exactly. But the main thing I think is if you dedicate enough time of steady state, like low intensity, steady state exercise to like actually make adaptations, like cardio adaptations, then you don't have as much time to do strength power stuff partly. But it's just a lot of time using those type 1 fibers and a lot of time not using the type 2 fibers.
Yeah.
So we'll get into that more so later.
But it's an interesting point.
It is interesting.
Something I wasn't considering as I was putting together part 3. So gives me another thing to add and maybe look at.
Yeah. So yeah, that was the mitochondrial thing that I found was that it's like the cristae density is quite long term, similar to like the pliability of the pericardium, quite long term. I didn't find proof of this, but I do really have to imagine that we are able to get better at expressing mitochondria. Like I have to imagine that's an adaptation that can happen, but I'm not sure.
And you're talking about the long-term effects. I mean, that would make sense too, because if you go back to the classic work of Issurin, the Russian guy, with all the timeframes for resiliency of adaptations. And aerobic ability is the highest on that list in terms of it's the most resilient. It takes the longest time for those training effects that we get to break down and basically experience the effect of detraining.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking about the pericardium and the mitochondrial structural changes and probably the capillary density, honestly, probably every change that takes place that we just talked about is likely a long-term adaptation in the sense, I think the paper was 35 plus minus 5 days for something like that for aerobic detraining to take place. Mm-hmm. So basically, if you built up a certain level of aerobic capability, if you trained it every 30 days, in theory, you would never lose the training adaptations you got.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing is it doesn't seem to take very much to maintain the adaptations either.
No, and so that's what I'm saying is that the stuff that you found that says these are long-term adaptations, and the stuff that's come more from the sports science or the practical side that says, hey, you can keep up your aerobic ability with very minimal work, all aligns towards these being very resilient long-term changes that once you've made them, they basically stay.
Yep.
Doesn't take a lot of work to keep it up, which again, that would all line up, because I think just as important as knowing how long does it take to create adaptation, how long can you hold on to it?
Yep.
And
yeah, absolutely. Especially if we're talking about athletes that need to be doing multiple things, and that's kind of like what I put in my notes was, like with the adaptations that are so long term, like the pericardium and the crystal density, like if it's important for sport, it'll happen, because like if you only considered the time spent in like the weight room training for sport, where you're doing your speed power stuff, you're doing your strength stuff, you're doing your muscular endurance, your hypertrophy, your like aerobic endurance stuff, you have to do so many things first, like the majority of sports anyway, that you can't dedicate the amount of time you would need to achieve those adaptations unless the sport supported it. So I think about something like rugby or soccer, which are speed power sports, but with a very like high endurance component.
they're both 90. Rugby's 90 minutes, right?
It's 80 minutes, I think.
Oh, okay. But again,
Whatever.
like, yeah, and soccer is 90. So long. It's not a game of 10 seconds and it's over.
And like 40-45 minute halves, like you're going for a while, so, and if that's the case, then games and practices are going to be endurance training as
There's
well.
some type of metabolic load.
Right. Versus like if you're playing football, then it's not really endurance training. So, and that's fine, because endurance training, like these adaptations aren't crucial for your performance in football, but in soccer, rugby, they might be. So
because the capacity, quote unquote, capacity demands of those are different.
Yeah. So I just like, if it's not important for the sport, I wouldn't worry about it too much. And if it is important for the sport, then like the training for sport specifically will allow for it, I think, as well.
Well, and not only that, the other interesting thing too, and we're talking about like adaptation timelines, and in this case, we were talking about the detraining effect. That paper from Makula, the Polish guy, I think he's from Poland, or the research facilities in Poland, at the very least. That study they did with the soccer players was one training session over 8 weeks, and they saw improvement. Mm-hmm. So it's not even like you have to go out there and perform like 3, 4, 5 aerobic training sessions per week to see adaptations. So you can go after it like once a week, it seems. If you were an endurance athlete, probably not. If you're a marathoner, cyclist, something like that, you likely need to train it more frequently. But when you're talking about like rugby, soccer, things like that, it appears that if you go out and do something once a week, you can start to make some of those adaptations. It may take you a little bit longer, but like you said, you're juggling the demands of training so many different qualities that it's at least good to know in your back pocket that, hey, we can go out there once or twice a week, do a little bit of stuff, and we can improve aerobically.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like it's, yeah. And the short-term adaptations, they do happen quite quickly and don't take a lot of effort to make them happen. And and you can maintain those as well, so I mean, that's kind of getting into part 3 stuff as well. But um, yeah, it's good to know for sure that you can maintain these things with relatively little effort and build them with relatively little effort.
The other aspect we haven't really touched on within the oxygen uptake and the aerobic threshold part, because again, we talked about sort of the economy, the movement strategy. That's more of it's a different type of adaptation. But I went back and looked at some of the work from looking at the physiology of how things change when people are in space in low pressure environments, and then how things change when we're in high altitude, low oxygen environments. And some interesting things take place at the level of the vessels.
Okay.
So we've talked about like what happens at the heart, what happens at the muscle, but they're all connected via the vessel, like your veins, your arteries, capillaries, all those types of things. And I mean, those things respond as well.
Mhm.
Right. So as we improve stroke volume, as we improve cardiac output, if we do exercise where the pressure of the system increases, the blood pressure, you see a lot of changes in the vessels that carry oxygenated blood. They're already thicker to begin with because they deal with higher pressure than the veins, but you will see thickening of those arteries and those oxygen carrying vessels as well, to help deal with the increased pressure demands as the heart becomes more powerful. And I think that's an important adaptation as well, because if we're talking about getting oxygen from outside into the heart to the muscles, the vessels play a huge role in that. And it's clear that those things happen because, for example, in space, the pressure change, we deal with unequal pressure in our body when we're on Earth, because gravity naturally causes blood to pool towards the center of the Earth. So we see greater thickness in those or oxygen carrying vessels in like the lower limbs. Right. So the pressure in our feet, for example, is higher than the pressure in our head.
Yep. Makes sense.
But when you go into space, it all evens out. So then you see when people come back from space, or they mimic a lot of the stuff with bed rest, because then they can tilt you level with gravity and create an equal pressure gradient. But then you see thickening of arteries in the upper half of the body that normally don't deal with that pressure because gravity doesn't allow you. And then you see, I don't know if it'd be like atrophy or less capability of that in the lower limbs, because now they're being constantly exposed to less pressure. And of course, you take a stimulus away. So there's no doubt that there's adaptation at the level of the arteries and the oxygen carrying parts of the vessels that will change as a result of the heart either pumping more powerfully, or you undergo exercise and pressure goes up within your system because you're moving blood around faster, which I think is interesting, because then it helps if those artery walls are not capable of dealing with the higher pressure, then you're going to have a harder time delivering blood and oxygen around the body.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, I do remember. It might have been when we talked with Zach one of the times.
Yeah, it definitely was. Because I don't know when we would have brought up vessels in any of the other episodes.
That's right. I feel like he also mentioned something like there's a theory or a model or whatever where like the heart is, like, he said it was small, like it's so small to be able to like contract and then push all the blood around the body that you need like obviously compliance from the vessels to like receive the pressure, and then the fact that they contract as well, like they have the like smooth muscle and they're like elastic as well to kind of like the left ventricle contracts and then shoots a huge amount of blood and pressure into the aorta, and like the aorta like balloons and then contracts again to send it out throughout the body. I think he described something like that.
Yeah, it's constant ballooning
Yeah,
to help
which
with the pressure.
makes sense. And obviously, if your arteries don't adapt, then at some point the pressure is just going to make your aorta explode. Um, you know,
Which is not good.
no, it's not good. Um, but also, I imagine that those adaptations help, like, allow for the heart to be more efficient, because the heart doesn't need to work as hard if the arteries are helping, push the blood along.
Exactly. So again, I'm sort of extrapolating a little bit because this is all coming from space and bed rest studies, but I imagine you would see those changes
Mhm.
as a result of exercise as
Yeah.
well. That, like you said, the vessels are adapting to make it easier to move things
Mhm.
around the body. So I think that's kind of an interesting point because again, the vessels play a huge role in moving things
Mhm.
around the body. So there's no doubt they're going to adapt. And then the other thing from like the altitude stuff is the changes within you talked about one of the first changes being an increase in plasma volume. So the amount of blood or the amount of volume within our system. But altitude training has been shown to create some adaptations in increased red blood cell or hemoglobin count,
Mhm.
which
Yep.
obviously those are I don't know what you want to call them, the cells within the blood
Yep.
that carry the oxygen
Yeah. Primarily, for sure.
primarily, that move the oxygen around the body. So if you have more hemoglobin, more red blood cells, you in theory can move more oxygen.
Yep.
And so there's been some work that shows that at altitude, because you have less oxygen available to breathe in, every breath brings you less oxygen. And so as a result, then the body creates more hemoglobin or red blood cells so that it helps increase the chances of what little oxygen you're bringing in is finding
Mhm.
a vehicle or a ride to wherever it has to go within the body, which, if we're talking about endurance performance, is obviously helpful because if we can move more oxygen around the system, we can theoretically improve performance. But the adaptation is really interesting because it's basically from the research that I was able to pull from this class, this KIN 402,
Mhm.
was that there's theoretically that's what should happen. And it's driven by breathing. And so this constant exposure to higher levels of breathing, that's what signals the body to go, okay, we're breathing more. We need to take advantage of the oxygen that we're bringing in. And as we
Mhm.
know from other classes we've taken and research, that we know that like uptake and heart rate and things like that is a very linear
Mhm.
pattern. And so, and you can create more if you do endurance training or do whatever, you create more red blood cells. You can
Mhm.
increase your hemoglobin count. And it makes sense that if you and I start once or twice a week going for a run, we could potentially get that because we're exposing our body to that linear increase in breathing. But what's interesting is that doesn't always happen at altitude. So
Mhm.
there are responders and there are non-responders. So you and I might go to the top of a really high mountain, and yes, we both need to increase our breathing rate because there's less oxygen available. But one of us will, let's say, will stay on that linear pattern. So it matches the response that the body's looking for. People who are non-responders, they show these really sporadic and random breathing patterns that don't really mimic the typical demands of exercise, which is why those people, it's hypothesized, don't respond well to altitude, because then they're not getting the response that the body needs to create more
Hmm.
hemoglobin, which is what I was kind of getting from these papers. Maybe I have it a little bit wrong. Obviously this is not my area of expertise, but that would explain why some people respond really well to altitude stuff and other people don't, that it was the breathing response that actually drives the adaptation.
Hmm.
So if the breathing response is thrown off, now I don't know if there's a way, I mean, I guess maybe there's a way that you could test that. Because again, this maybe parlays a little bit more into part 3, where you're talking about using altitude training as like a performance enhancing means. But you would want to figure out if someone's a responder or a non-responder before you sent them on a trip to the mountains
Yeah.
to go do
Definitely.
endurance training. So I'm sure there's a way that you could figure out, like artificially, whether it was through like, I don't know, that breathing test with the paper bag. So you get increased levels of CO2 or,
Yeah.
and then less oxygen available or whatever. But it was an interesting sort of adaptation because, again, that's,
Mm-hmm.
we see increased hemoglobin and red blood cells as a result of endurance training, but we also see it as a result of, in some cases, being in high altitudes,
Mm-hmm.
but only if you're like a quote unquote responder
Mm-hmm.
to that. So an interesting adaptation, but again, I think it's important that we at least touch on the vessels a little bit and the plasma and the fluid that's contained within it, because it plays a role.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought that up too, because I've completely skipped over the red blood cells, because yes, we do make more of them, and it's evident when you give blood, more than once, and you don't run out of red blood cells. Um, so yes, we are capable of that, and endurance training does. That's a longer term adaptation than the plasma. I think
Absolutely.
that's like a weeks to. Well, you can give blood like every 3 months or something like that, or 4 months maybe. I don't know. So it's a weeks to months thing. I think maybe it happens faster at altitude if you're a responder.
Yeah, I think a lot of the studies they were looking over like 2 or 3 week periods.
Yeah.
So I
Okay.
mean,
So
you can
that's
make adaptations and respond to low altitude in, call it a couple of weeks. It seems like,
yeah.
if
Yeah.
you handle it well,
Yeah.
apparently.
And so just quickly, there's one more thing that I wanted to touch on before we
Okay. Yeah, the
finish
rest
off.
of the altitude stuff I was going to bring up in the next episode because it's more training based, I
Yeah.
think.
Well, I was just going to ask quick if the non-responders to altitude, they do still respond to exercise, I'm sure. Right.
Oh, I would think so.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just you may not be able to get that. Like, let's say you're, again, I'm going to pull random numbers. Let's say your red blood cells, it count as at 10.
Yeah.
And then you do some endurance training and it goes to 15. And then someone goes, oh, yeah. And if I go to altitude, I can make it 20.
Right.
I imagine it's that jump from 15 to 20 to get those extra
Hmm.
red blood cells that a responder might be able to get and a non-responder may not be able to get.
Right. Okay.
Which is probably why people do EPO injections and all the rest of it to artificially enhance how much red blood cells they have available.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I obviously don't know for sure. It's not my area of expertise by any means.
Yeah, no, it's all good. Yeah, and then we talked about the vessels. We talked about the capillaries, which is like a medium term. I think that's like a week's kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, so then the last thing we said at the beginning, you can improve basically like this side of the threshold and the other side of the threshold by like producing less metabolites or clearing them faster. And the one interesting study, I don't remember the exact task, but it was like they measured everyone's VO2 max. It was cyclists, I think, and they did some sort of a cycling task, and performance matched like the VO2 max essentially. So everyone performed as expected, except for like two people performed better than expected. And this was like an anaerobic based cycling task.
Okay.
And two people performed much better than expected. And when they looked into it, these people had way higher than normal capillary density. And the thought process is that they're able to clear metabolites faster because there's just so much more like blood flow in and around the muscles to like,
which would be needed to clear everything out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that found that to be a very, very interesting thing. And then the other part of this adaptation is the enzymes that do the clearing. You can adapt to express more of those, similarly to how I'm imagining you adapt to express more mitochondria. You can adapt to express more of these enzymes, which I don't know the names of them. I never really
There's
cared
probably
to pay
more than
attention.
one.
Yeah, I don't really ever care to pay attention to the names of enzymes.
No, there's how many enzymes you have to go through with the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Like there's a bunch of them out there.
No, thank you. But yeah, and so you can adapt to produce more of these enzymes and clear them faster. And that's really just from exposure to like a high metabolically active environment more often. So it's the same kind of thing with everything. Basically, intensity goes up, and the body responds to make it more tolerable.
Yeah. And in this case, it goes, wow, look at all these metabolites that are hanging around now consistently that we never had before. Well, we better create more enzymes to get rid of these metabolites.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
Dingo over here keeps going for a run 3 times a week.
Yeah.
And now we have no choice but to do this.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think that's everything. Or I mean, there's more stuff, I'm sure, but that's the main stuff, I think.
I would have a harder time talking about anything else without starting to get into like the training ideas and debates around that type of stuff. So I think we've done a decent job keeping it to just what's adapting, what's changing.
Yeah.
And sort of touching on some part 3 stuff, but not really diving too deep into it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this will be a more interesting part 3 than I was expecting too. Like there's more stuff that came up that I thought about. So yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. So we're looking forward to that one. Also looking forward to hearing your music selections and sharing my music selections after a longer break. We are now officially recording on the other side of holidays, or well, in the middle of them, I guess.
Yeah, in the middle. This will go out in the new year. It's recorded in 2021, but it'll probably debut in 2022.
Definitely. Yeah. Last year's, we didn't do a Christmas special this year.
No, we didn't.
We maybe could do that for the fun episode coming up after this series.
Or we could pick a different holiday. Who knows? We can
Valentine's Day.
No, we're not doing that's not a holiday. That's not a holiday. That's the dumbest day in the world.
It's a commercial holiday.
Yeah, it's a stupid holiday.
Don't get me started on that. It'll be around that time, I think. You know, like it'll be February-ish when that one goes out.
We're not doing. I'll just on air for everyone to hear. We're not doing that.
Okay.
I promise you, everyone. Don't worry, it's not coming. I'm shutting this down immediately.
A Family Day holiday special.
Okay, we could do that instead.
Because that's February too, isn't it?
Yeah. I'd be more open to a Family Day special than a Valentine's Day special.
All right.
Both are kind of dumb holidays, but one actually gives you a day off. So I'm not going to complain about Family Day.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Sounds good. Yeah. So what have you been listening to during the holiday season or not?
Well, I mean, I'm always listening to the usual stuff. So I'll share another one that I've come across. You know me, I go in waves with some of this stuff. But I've been listening to Sabaton a little bit more. They're a Swedish power metal band, but they're very history focused. So all their songs are about like actual events in the past. So it's cool. And it's got the face melting guitars and the melodic metal theme to it, which is always kind of nice. But it's a different take where everything they do is historically based. Maybe not historically accurate because it can only be as accurate as the records show. Yeah. We don't have a time machine, but all based on historical events of some kind.
That's very cool.
Interesting band, interesting theme and genre, but still very metal and good to listen to. So yeah, I've been playing them a little bit more recently. So that's going to be my pick.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite interesting. I do really enjoy music that tells a story rather than just being like a collection of ideas.
Or like the same line over and over again.
Yeah.
Like an EDM song.
There's a song, I think it's Fire and Flame is what it's called, by the Longest Johns, who I've mentioned before. And I will mention again, not this time, because I'm going to try to keep my music selections in order, because I sometimes have a hard time finding new ones, right? So now I've got a few ones that I want to make sure I share them all and don't use them all up on one episode.
That's fair.
But Longest Johns have a song on their third album. I can't remember what it's called. But I think the song's called Fire and Flame. And it's about, I assume this is a real event during World War I or II, when their like ships collided in like the harbor at Halifax, and then like Halifax got pretty messed up. It might have been
the Halifax explosion.
Yeah.
That's a well documented
event. Know. Yeah,
or I've heard of it.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't know, but
you never heard of it?
I've heard about it through the song.
Oh, okay.
It's a good song too.
Yeah.
So I might recommend you check that out if you like that sort of stuff. It's a sea shanty, which
I'll
always
take it's
sounds,
one song. It's not going to kill me.
yeah, I like how they do it. But yeah, and then so I've was listening to Lil Nas X, which is completely different than what you were listening to, which is fine. But very, very poppy with like a rap flavor, which is nice. Yeah, he's got a lot of catchy songs, so it's always
Well, if you're
easy
going to be
listening.
pop, it's got to be catchy.
Mhm.
That's like the only thing you have to do in a pop song is just be catchy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So if
and
you can't deliver on that, you're not in the pop music genre.
yeah, and I mean, at least some of his songs are very much more like openly gay, which is a nice statement to make as well, because I believe he's the only openly gay rapper right now. Um, Maybe the only openly gay pop star. I don't know. So
Pop, yeah. I mean, I'm not well versed with the pop
yeah, and
world
I
and
know
who
that.
technically exists in it.
Yeah,
Um, I know of people like that within the genres of music I listen to,
yeah,
but yeah, pop might be a little bit different because I listen to stuff that's a little bit more underground in the sense that,
yeah. This is much more mainstream for sure.
yeah, and obviously mainstream would carry greater pressure to, you know,
Yeah,
conform to certain things and
much
whatever.
more
So
public scrutiny. Yeah.
yeah, it's a little easier to express yourself in whatever you want in an underground
Mhm.
sort of subculture as opposed to, like you said, the mainstream. But
Mhm. Yeah. So, anyway, but it's good stuff. Very catchy. So I'm
it's the name
sure
of the game.
everybody listening knows who that is. So that's not new.
Even I
But
know that it's poppy and popular enough that I've heard the name.
yeah, that's right. Um, but yeah, so nice to be back for part two. Looking forward to part three as
It
always.
is.
If people have any questions, concerns, comments, or suggestions, let us know. Speed Strength Show, Speed Strength Performance, Britain Southern, or Directed Strength. Now I have been posting more on my business account, which
I
has been
did
good to
notice
do
that. I
as
didn't even know
well.
it had an account. Well,
Yeah,
now I do, obviously, because I follow it, but I didn't know that. Yeah. So
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. So we're back. We're back on there making content and whatnot. So look out for that. Um, until then, that was the Speed Strength Show. Thanks for coming along, world.
we'll see you next time.
Peace.